Hello, and welcome to a game discourse concerning probably the most groundbreaking point-and-click adventure game of the PlayStation 1 era, A Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars. Now, to preface, this featured as one of my first game discourses in the first episodes I ever recorded, but, looking back on it, the quality is quite horrifying in terms of my personal delivery and the actual audio itself. So, upon finding my lecture notes on this original review, I'm opting to revitalise this retrospective and really give Broken Sword its due. Now, Broken Sword is one of those games that, in my opinion, can really be used as evidence for how the medium of video games is being elevated and can be elevated to the same standards of great art and literature. And this is something I think was probably overlooked upon its release in 1996 because people simply weren't really, to my knowledge, looking at video games that way. I think they were beginning to, but certainly as time has passed and modern art and culture continues to liberalise and incorporate new media into it, I think people are finally kind of looking back at these classic games and seeing aspects of them that thread quite neatly into an art historical narrative. And, they're beginning to be judged, even in video game journalism, by the same criteria that we would normally use to judge literature and movies and classical art by. And I think this is specific to Broken Sword, and the reason I bring it up now is the fact that even in 1996, Broken Sword is a game that preceded and has drawn comparisons to frequently Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. And this is an observation that's been made by both fans and also put to the Broken Sword creator, Charles Cecil, in interview, chiefly because, as I've said, Broken Sword predates Dan Brown's novel by a number of years. And I think it's raised some sort of small controversy about it. And, that's not what I'm getting at here, and I'm not kind of going into that, was Broken Sword a blueprint or an influence on Dan Brown? That's not the discussion we're having here. But what struck me about it was the fact that people were discussing a video game by the same standards and the same, they're drawing parallels with narrative depth and caliber and quality, of which personally I think Broken Sword is better anyway. But, they're having this discourse about, a very popular work of modern literature, or at least popular modern fiction, and drawing comparisons to a video game about it. And I think this speaks volumes about the caliber of literary elements that video games are now finally being acknowledged to possess. And, on my note, and as someone that's always defended video games to this end, it's not just that there's a literary plot device that's similar to a novel, but we have to remember that video games employ immersive gameplay, music, art direction, graphics, and a successful combination of these interactive and engaging, user experience devices. So these are all contributing factors that I think produce a modern synthesis of traditional and modern media art. And I think Broken Sword is a prime example of this. So Broken Sword kind of not just, having these literary qualities to it in terms of its narrative trajectory, but also having gameplay, art direction, a fantastic music score, and of course the inherent engagement and functionality of the player, via their avatar. I think this kind of synthesis of all these different artistic mediums also reminds me of another point of art historical discussion, which is the idea of the gesamtkunstwerk, which was conceived of by the composer-philosopher Richard Wagner back in the 1800s. And gesamtkunstwerk basically translates to total art or complete artwork. And in his time, Wagner conceived of the total art or the opera, because it brought painting in for the backdrops, it brought in acting, it brought in singing and music, all these different mediums that kind of coalesced to create this immersive experience. And it was supposed to be this total immersion for the audience into the art. And again, the reason I bring this up now is because I think the theory of total art, applies quite strongly to video games, because they're not only sort of analogous to Wagner's theory of the opera, but they're actually an enhancement of this ideal, because by their very nature, you're placed inside a virtual realm and you're controlling and interacting with the art via your your avatar, in this case George Stobart. So rather than the opera where you're just kind of passively watching the art take place before you, video games are a medium in which you are participating. You're a participant in the artwork that's taking place around you. And I think that's really, interesting to prefix this talk on Broken Sword with, simply because, as I've said, it's been compared to an existing artwork and a piece of popular media. So yeah, I'm just drawing these parallels between it. So anyway, let's go ahead and talk about Broken Sword. As already mentioned, it's a point-and-click adventure game. And by its very nature, actually, particularly in the time and place it was published, I was always of the opinion that it might divide an audience. And I think it's a very it's almost an anomaly in the time and place it was released. Because with the PlayStation 1, what we saw was a market that was flooded with these new innovative action-based 3D platformers, basically, who are all kind of vying for the attention of their publishers to become the next big thing and the console mascot. Of course, we had games like Crash Bandicoot, Croc, Gex, Tomb Raider. All of these sort of things that were really pushing 3D came out around this time, kind of showing off the magnitude and the power of the PlayStation 1. So, as a gamer attuned to and growing up in this environment, as I was actually, I came up, had a SNES, then a Sega, then a PlayStation 1. So, I kind of grew up in this environment and witnessed this transition to the big thing that was 3D at this time. So, you might be surprised to see a game like Broken Sword released and not only be released, but actually succeed, hugely, in this sort of market demographic. I mean, my personal discovery of Broken Sword, digressing slightly, was because it was on I first discovered it as a demo. I don't think it was on the demo 1 disc that came with the PlayStations. So I think it may have been on one of the official UK PlayStation Magazine demo discs, because they were released monthly with a collection of demos on them. But yeah, I played that, and I think, it was the onboarding, the initial sequence at the Parisian Cafe. And I was sort of instantly hooked on this game, and it really grabbed my attention. So I sought out to buy it immediately. Although it's worth noting, actually, because I was so young at the time, I didn't manage to complete the game for a number of years because I was far too young to have the sort of concentration, intelligence, or lateral thinking required to kind of get on with a game like that. But I was certainly enamored with it, simply because actually it was a break from the norm for me. There was no sitting around waiting for the box smashing and the gem collection to begin, like you'd get with another platformer. There was no waiting for the guns to come out and this shooting gameplay to start, because, there is no shooting in this game. It's a steadily paced, cerebral point-and-click game that requires patience and lateral thinking in spades. One of the great things and the most frustrating things about Broken Sword, in fact, is that at times you're left stumped with the vague knowledge of what goes where. For example, you have item A, and you're vaguely aware that it connects to object C, but you're at a total loss of how to navigate your way through process B, to kind of reach that conclusion and that goal. And that kind of epitomizes the sort of puzzle elements of Broken Sword, where in any other circumstances this would actually probably deter me from a game and frustrate me massively. But this leads me on to the second factor, and in fact actually probably the most important factor for me about why Broken Sword succeeds, and that is the quality of the plot, driven by these fantastic, engaging characters that Charles Cecil and his team have created here. I mean, the plot, delivery, and the narrative makeup of Broken Sword actually really reminds me of, some classic detective novels. And I really can't help but think of the Victorian novelist Wilkie Collins for some reason. And I've read 2 of this guy's books, The Woman in White and The Moonstone. And whenever I read them, I can't help but think of Broken Sword, because Collins produced probably the earliest example of a detective novel, but his narrative device for delivering the story was through internal monologues and character observations, via diary entries. So, being used to this first-person sort of conversation with you almost, it was really interesting narrative tool, because, of course, it's how George Stobart conveys his opinions and his humorous observations, to the player throughout Broken Sword. And, I think between George and Nico, who are the classic kind of odd couple dynamic in this, and obviously, of course, there's the secondary romance that blooms between them. But I think that they package and deliver the dialogue and the story really well. And I'll go on to talk about them in detail a bit later. But suffice to say, the way that we have this kind of conversational dialogue going on, or monologue going on with George, is a really great way to deliver this story. And secondly, and again, this is subjective to myself, but I really just love fictional narratives that are set in a plausibly real location and set against real events that could be quite plausible. So in this instance, it's the Knights Templar, and the Knights Templar mythology is just cool in and of itself without having this kind of fiction around it. And I love history, and I love the mysterious aspects of history, and of course the Knights Templar are one of those curious aspects of European history, controversial and fascinating in equal measure. So I think it's just put to really good use in this game. And Broken Sword, in fact, all of the Broken Sword games capitalise very well on history. And I think Charles Cecil is obviously, I think he's a bit of an autodidact. I don't know what his actual qualifications are, but clearly, he knows his history and he knows his stuff when it comes to this. In fact, if Revolution weren't based up north, I really would like to try and work for them. I would work for them for free, probably, to try and work on some of these great stories with them. I think the Templar Knights mythology is used to really good effect, and on top of this as well, we have the locations and talking about this kind of plausibility of real place. Broken Sword just has this brilliant art direction that is almost cartoonish and Disney-esque in its aesthetic. But you can look at the Parisian street scene and say, oh yes, that looks like Paris, that's a Parisian boulevard. Or you can look at the pub in Ireland and be like, yeah, I can see that, looking like the rural Irish countryside. So the actual art direction is fantastic in how it weaves credibility in with this inherently cartoonish and playfulness of its visuals. So taking a step forward into the narrative and looking at the characters, Broken Sword sees us in control of the somewhat hapless American holidaying in Paris, George Stobart. And this guy kind of buffoons his way through much of the story like an American Hugh Grant. And we have these humorous character interactions and dialogue with him that keeps us kind of entertained and progresses the plot despite the quite, really, I suppose quite harrowing and morbid story, which starts off with a cafe bombing. So, and I think Broken Sword actually, it has a very distinct brand of British humour. Despite us having an American protagonist, I think the humour is quite British in that, we have this dry wit and observational comedy. And of course, it plays very heavily on cultural stereotype, which, being British, we love quite a lot for some reason. So, even looking at George as a person, he's been designed as an American that will just go and speak English to people and, that sort of thing. And I think, to me personally, I think it's quite obvious that this game was developed by a British company despite having an American hero. And I think the hero is American on purpose because the connotations of an American tourist has humour rooted in it, and his kind of failure to grasp European customs, and also on the flip side, allows him to deliver these comedic observations on the Europeans he interacts with. It has this kind of good dynamic to it, and I think that making the protagonist British wouldn't quite have worked so well. And I think this could be for two reasons. Firstly, I think with the English accent it's quite difficult because you have either, if you have anything that doesn't sound like Queen's English, you could be considered a Cockney or like blue collar, whether you're from North or South or whatever, And then if you have Queen's English, you instantly seem like you're the landed gentry. So I think it's quite hard to kind of make an everyman sort of hero from a British character. On the other hand, I believe there's some sort of all-roundness. I think George Stobart's voice actor, there's this American accent that has an all-roundness to it. It's familiar because we've all grown up in light of, Hollywood movies and this exposure, this global exposure to Hollywood movies. So there's a sort of familiarity to the everyman accent of American, which in turn I think would make the audience appeal much wider for this game. And of course, American does have regional accents, but personally, I'm not entirely. I can't really distinguish them. I can tell New York, I can tell Southern, but I couldn't tell you where from in the South. And with George Stobart, I think George is supposed to be from Idaho, but he's voiced by Ralph Saxon, who's from Virginia. So they're kind of polarizing sides of the American landmass, and I really couldn't tell you where George is from with his accent. He just sounds American to me. So yeah, again, just this nice, familiar, everyman sort of accent. So, looking at George as our avatar and stepping forward into the narrative, Broken Sword, I'd say kind of 80% of Broken Sword is people yakking it at each other. It's kind of dialogue. And, looking at the time and place it was released, I think it would be hard pushed to kind of... It sounds weird on paper that, this game is basically puzzles and then people talking at each other. And that's what it is, And I think this game would kind of fall flat if it weren't for the quality of the host of other characters that we interact with throughout the game, and we sort of quiz and ply for information. George and Nico in particular have these funny discussions between each other, and the romantic subtext which evolves there and evolved in later Broken Sword games. Nico has this kind of shrewdness and pragmatism that contrasts brilliantly with George's kind of bumbling, as I've said, American Hugh Grant sort of demeanour. And their conflicting personalities provide both comic relief and obviously this kind of collective patchworking together of the mystery. And I really like how we go through kind of narrative, we go down a narrative journey and then we kind of reconvene at Nico's flat, for example, and you sort of, there's a good pace set between these two and within the story in general. And on top of this, we have a supporting cast of various locals in various locations, and in my opinion, these guys are brilliant, and the ones that inhabit Ireland and France are easily among the funniest when it comes to George attempting to ply them for information and blend in as well, which he often tries to do, and it's just really ridiculous and funny to try and see how he interacts with these different cultures and eccentric individuals. So as I've said, it's written very well, and I think this isn't done just in terms of story, but also in dialogue and how they portray these different cultures, because of course stereotyping and deriving humour from a cultural stereotype is a very fine line, and this is you have to be careful not to offend. But I think, and again, we're dealing actually with a story that does touch on historical mythologies, ethnic groups and religion, so I think it's very difficult not to offend audiences with this sort of thing. And I think the reason A Broken Sword succeeds so well and doesn't offend any, or at least hopefully not, is because it obviously doesn't take itself too seriously. There's no real conviction or sincerity behind the piss-taking that we see in Broken Sword. It's obviously just done tongue-in-cheek, and it balances the kind of severity of the actual storyline and the people being murdered and stuff with actually a real light-heartedness. So it's just very carefully constructed and well done, I think. So this cast of characters, I've been noting, they're kind of weaved very well into this storyline that's certainly, whilst not serious per se, certainly dramatic and oft-times intense. And finally, I just want to make a note on a final character before I wrap up here, which is the elusive Mr. Khan, who permeates and prompts many of the action and puzzle scenarios that take place throughout the game. I'm going to say villain in quote marks, but I just think that this guy we're kind of pursuing and trying to spy on throughout the game is a really interesting and quite chilling personality. And there's appearances he makes throughout the game where we really want to kind of escape because he's so menacing. But I think he's a really good pseudo antagonist that we have throughout, particularly the first portion of this game. And I think he was done very well, so is worth a mention. Finally, super wrapping up now, I just want to mention the music, and the music score for not just this Broken Sword, but actually the entirety of the series is actually really well done. And I listen to the Broken Sword soundtrack while I'm at work quite a lot of the time, because it's one of those quite calming soundtracks. I think it has this sort of nostalgic feel to it. I can't really put my finger on it, but I think it's just a really nice OST for this game. So wrapping up, I may well go on to speak about subsequent Broken Swords in later episodes, but Broken Sword 1 for me was the one. Broken Sword 2 was good. They'd done the switch to 3D, which was actually quite contentiously received by long-time fans of the series, of which I count myself. And then we have Broken Sword 5, The Serpent's Curse. And actually having conversations with some fans of Broken Sword in general, their reception to Serpent's Curse was quite mixed as well, but I'm actually completely enamoured with it. I'm really on board with the fifth instalment of the series. And in many ways I see it as a homage to The Shadow of the Templar in a lot of ways, because there's some overlap and consistency with the plot trajectory and the setting. And I think it's almost like A New Hope, the Star Wars film, which is kind of referenced in Force Awakens, where Force Awakens seems almost to be an homage to A New Hope, in this kind of analogous plot set pieces. I think, Broken Sword 5 is the same thing. But that's not a bad thing. I actually think it's quite a positive, and the way that they've actually gone back to the original art style as well was actually really, really brilliant for a Serpent's Curse. So I may talk about that game at a later date. But suffice to say, this has been quite a high-level overview of Broken Sword 1, but I think it's really just worthy of discussion, and I wanted to bring to light some of the opinions I have pertaining towards it.